you've been there, your heart racing, your voice rising, your logic crumbling as an argument spirals completely out of control. Every word you speak seems to make things worse, and you watch helplessly as relationships fracture and opportunities slip away because you couldn't maintain your composure when it mattered most. I am Dale Carnegie, and I spent decades studying human nature, teaching millions how to win friends and influence people through the simple art of staying calm under pressure. What I discovered about maintaining composure in conflict will transform every difficult conversation you face, giving you the power to turn arguments into opportunities and adversaries into allies. The principles I'll share aren't just theories, they're battle-tested strategies that have helped countless people navigate the most challenging interpersonal situations with grace and effectiveness. But first, like this video, subscribe for more transformational wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to see how far the need for peaceful resolution has spread across our world. I wasn't always the man who preached the power of staying calm in arguments. In fact, I was quite the opposite. Growing up on our farm in Warrensburg, Missouri, I had what you might call a hair-trigger temper. When I felt challenged or criticized, my immediate instinct was to fight back with words as sharp as any weapon. My father, James William Carnegie, was a hard-working man who demanded excellence from his children. He had strong opinions about how things should be done, and unfortunately, so did I. We were like two stubborn bulls locked in the same pen, neither willing to back down when our views collided. The incident that changed everything happened when I was 16. My father had criticized my work on repairing a section of fence that had been damaged in a storm. I had spent hours on it, working in the blazing sun, and I was proud of what I'd accomplished. When he pointed out several flaws in my work, suggesting I had been careless and lazy, something inside me exploded. I worked harder on that fence than you've ever worked on anything, I shouted, my face burning with anger and humiliation. Nothing I do is ever good enough for you. What followed was the most vicious argument we'd ever had. We stood there in the barnyard, hurling accusations and resentments that had been building for years. I said things I can never take back, cruel things about his failures as a farmer, his inability to provide better for our family, his constant criticism that made me feel worthless. I watched my father's face change as my words hit their mark. The anger drained away, replaced by something much worse, deep, crushing hurt. In that moment, I realized I had won the argument, but lost something far more precious. I had wounded the man who had sacrificed everything to give me opportunities. He never had. We didn't speak for 3 days, 3 of the longest days of my young life. I was too proud to apologize, and he was too hurt to reach out first. It was my mother who finally intervened, sitting me down in the kitchen and helping me understand what I had done. Dale, she said gently, you may have been right about some things, but being right isn't worth destroying the people you love. Your father's criticism comes from love, even when it doesn't feel that way. He wants you to succeed because he cares about your future. That conversation changed my entire perspective on conflict. I realized that most arguments aren't really about the surface issue at all. They're about deeper needs for respect, understanding, and love. When we attack others in anger, we're usually defending against our own feelings of inadequacy or fear. Went to my father that evening and apologized not just for my words, but for my inability to hear his concern beneath his criticism. We talked for hours, really talked, perhaps for the first time in years. I learned that his high standards came from his own father's harsh criticism, and his fear that I might face the same struggles he had endured. That night, I made a promise to myself that would shape the rest of my life. I would never again let anger control my words or damage my relationships. I would learn to stay calm, to listen beneath the surface, and to respond with wisdom rather than react with emotion. This promise became the foundation of everything I would later teach about human relations. Asterisk, asterisk, the lesson from that farm incident with my father might have stayed buried in my personal life, if not for a devastating professional experience that hammered home the true cost of losing one's temper. This happened years later, when I was working as a traveling salesman for Armour and Company, selling bacon and soap to general stores across the Midwest. I had been courting a potential major client, the owner of a small chain of stores who could single-handedly double my commission for that quarter. After weeks of relationship building, I finally had him ready to sign a substantial order. We met in his office on a sweltering July afternoon in 1902, and everything was going perfectly until he made an offhand comment about the quality of our bacon being inferior to a competitor's product. Now, I had absolute confidence in our product. I had tasted both. I knew our superior curing process, and I had testimonials from satisfied customers. When he disparaged what I knew to be an excellent product, my pride flared like a match struck in dry grass. "Mr. Henderson," I said, my voice rising with indignation, "you clearly don't know quality when you see it. That competitor's bacon you're praising is nothing but cheap, poorly cured meat that will leave your customers dissatisfied and your reputation damaged." The temperature in that small office seemed to drop 20 degrees. I watched Mr. Henderson's friendly demeanor evaporate as his face hardened into granite. He had been personally recommending that competitor's product to his customers for months, and I had just called his judgment into question in front of his employees. "Young man," he said, standing up slowly, "I've been in this business longer than you've been alive. I think I can judge bacon quality for myself. This meeting is over." I tried to backtrack, to salvage the situation, but the damage was done. Not only did I lose that substantial order, but Mr. Henderson made sure to tell every store owner in the region about the arrogant young salesman from Armour who insulted his intelligence. My reputation in that territory was destroyed, and it took me nearly a year to rebuild the trust I had shattered in that single moment of heated pride. But the real cost wasn't just the lost sales. It was the lost relationship. Mr. Henderson was a respected figure in the community, a man whose opinion carried weight with dozens of other potential clients. By attacking his judgment instead of respecting his perspective, I had closed doors that would never open again. That night in my boarding house room, I sat down and wrote what I came to think of as my letter of accountability to myself. I listed every relationship I had damaged through heated arguments, every opportunity I had lost by letting my temper override my judgment, every bridge I had burned in moments of righteous indignation. The list was longer than I cared to admit. There was the college debate where I had attacked my opponent's character instead of his arguments, losing the respect of the judges. The heated exchange with a professor who had criticized my essay, resulting in a lower grade for the entire course. The argument with a childhood friend that ended a friendship over something so trivial, I could barely remember what started it. As I reviewed this painful inventory, a pattern emerged. In every case, I had prioritized being right over being effective. I had chosen the temporary satisfaction of expressing my anger over the long-term value of maintaining relationships and achieving my goals. I was winning battles and losing wars, proving my points while destroying my prospects. That night, I made a decision that would transform not just my sales career, but my entire approach to human relations. I resolved to never again let my need to be right supersede my need to be successful in building lasting, positive relationships with others. Asterisk, asterisk, my painful experiences had taught me that losing my temper was costly, but I still didn't understand why people, including myself, became so defensive and argumentative in the first place. That understanding came through years of teaching public speaking classes at the YMCA in New York City. where I had the unique opportunity to observe hundreds of people under pressure. One evening, I received a letter that would become one of my most treasured teaching tools. A student named Robert had written me a scathing, angry letter after I had gently corrected his pronunciation during a class presentation. His letter was filled with accusations that I was trying to humiliate him, that I didn't understand his background, and that my teaching methods were destructive to students' confidence. My first instinct was to fire back a defensive response, explaining my good intentions and correcting his misunderstandings about my methods. But something made me pause. Instead of responding immediately, I decided to study this letter as if it were a window into human nature itself. What I discovered in that letter, and in the hundreds of similar situations I observed over the years, was that defensive behavior isn't really about the immediate issue at hand. Robert wasn't truly angry about pronunciation correction. He was protecting something much deeper: his sense of self-worth, his fear of appearing inadequate in front of his peers, and his need to feel respected and valued. I began to realize that, when people become argumentative, they're almost always defending against a perceived threat to their ego, their status, or their sense of competency. The businessman who argues about facts and figures isn't really fighting about data. He's fighting to preserve his reputation as someone who knows his business. The parent who argues with a teacher isn't really disputing educational methods. She's protecting her identity as a good parent who advocates for her child. This insight revolutionized my understanding of human conflict. I saw that behind every heated argument was a person trying to protect something precious to them: their dignity, their reputation, their sense of being a competent, worthwhile human being. When we challenge someone's position aggressively, we're not just questioning their opinion, we're threatening their self-image. I started paying closer attention to my students' body language and emotional reactions during discussions. When someone's voice rose or their posture stiffened, I could see the exact moment when they shifted from discussing an idea to defending their ego. Their rational mind would shut down, and their emotional protective systems would take over. The breakthrough came when I began experimenting with different approaches. Instead of directly correcting Robert's pronunciation, what if I had found a way to help him discover the correct pronunciation himself? Instead of pointing out errors, what if I focused on acknowledging what he was doing well before suggesting improvements? When I tried this approach with subsequent students, the results were remarkable. People who had been defensive and argumentative became collaborative and eager to learn. The difference wasn't in the content of what I was teaching, it was in how I preserved their dignity while helping them improve. I realized that every human being has an invisible sign hanging around their neck that reads, "Make me feel important and respected." When we honor this fundamental need, people open up to new ideas and different perspectives. When we threaten it, they close down and become combative. Regardless of how logical our arguments might be, this understanding extended far beyond the classroom. I began to see that successful marriages, effective business relationships, and even international diplomacy all depended on recognizing and respecting this basic human need for dignity and importance. The most persuasive people weren't those with the best arguments. They were those who made others feel heard, respected, and valued while presenting their ideas. The transformation in my own relationships was immediate and profound. When I stopped trying to prove I was right and started trying to understand and respect others' perspectives, conflicts that once would have escalated into arguments became opportunities for genuine communication and mutual understanding. Asterisk understanding. Why people become defensive was only half the battle. The other half was learning to recognize and control my own emotional reactions before they could hijack a conversation. This skill became crucial during my years in the debate society at State Teachers College in Warrensburg, where I learned that the difference between winning and losing often came down to who could maintain their composure under pressure. I kept detailed notes during this period, documenting my emotional patterns and triggers. What I discovered was both humbling and enlightening. I found that my anger had predictable warning signs. My shoulders would tense, my breathing would become shallow, and I would feel a familiar heat rising in my chest. Most telling of all, my vocabulary would change, would start using absolute terms like always and never, and my voice would take on a sharp, accusatory edge. The breakthrough came during a particularly heated debate about taxation policies. My opponent had made what I considered a completely illogical argument, and I felt that familiar surge of righteous indignation. But instead of immediately launching into my rebuttal, I forced myself to pause and take 3 deep breaths. In that brief moment of silence, something remarkable happened. I realized that attacking his logic wouldn't convince anyone. It would only make him defensive and the audience uncomfortable. Instead, I said, "That's an interesting perspective, John. I can see why someone might reach that conclusion. Let me share some additional information that might add to our discussion." The effect was immediate. John's defensive posture relaxed. The audience leaned in with interest, rather than bracing for conflict, and we had what became one of the most productive debates of the semester. That experience taught me that the moment between feeling triggered and responding is where all our power lies. In that space, we can choose between reaction and response, between escalation and de-escalation, between winning an argument and winning respect. I began developing what I called my emotional regulation techniques. The first was the physical. Pause, literally counting to 3 before speaking when I felt anger rising. During those 3 seconds, I would consciously relax my shoulders, deepen my breathing, and remind myself that my goal was communication, not combat. The second technique was perspective shifting. Instead of focusing on how wrong the other person was, I would ask myself, what might make an intelligent person believe what they're saying? What am I missing about their perspective? This simple shift from judgment to curiosity transformed my entire approach to disagreement. The third technique was the preframe. Before entering any potentially difficult conversation, I would remind myself of my true objective. Was I trying to prove I was right, or was I trying to solve a problem? Was I defending my ego, or was I seeking the best outcome for everyone involved? This mental preparation helped me stay focused on what really mattered. I also learned to recognize what I called emotional hijacking, those moments when strong feelings would override my rational thinking. The warning signs became as familiar as old friends: the urge to interrupt, the certainty that I was completely right and they were completely wrong, the desire to escalate rather than de-escalate. When I felt hijacking beginning, I developed a simple internal phrase: pause and breathe. What outcome do I really want here? This question would snap me back to my higher purpose and help me choose a more constructive response. The transformation in my relationships was remarkable. Colleagues who had once avoided difficult conversations with me began seeking my input on challenging situations. My wife Dorothy noticed that our discussions about household matters became more collaborative and less combative. Even my students responded differently. They seemed more willing to take risks and share their honest thoughts because they knew I wouldn't attack them for expressing different viewpoints. Most importantly, I discovered that emotional self-control wasn't about suppressing my feelings. It was about choosing how to express them constructively. I could still feel passionate about my beliefs without letting that passion destroy the very relationships I needed to influence and persuade others. Asterisk. The most revolutionary principle I discovered in my journey toward peaceful conflict resolution came from studying Abraham Lincoln, a man who seemed to possess an almost supernatural ability to bring people together despite profound disagreements. I spent countless hours analyzing his speeches, letters, and documented conversations, searching for the secret to his persuasive power. What I found was counterintuitive and, frankly, difficult for my competitive nature to accept. Lincoln almost never tried to win arguments. Instead, he avoided them altogether, choosing to redirect disagreement toward shared goals and common ground. This approach seemed weak to me at first, until I began to understand the profound wisdom behind it. I remember the moment this principle crystallized for me. I was attending a dinner party where two guests, both intelligent, successful men, came locked in a heated debate about business regulation. What started as a friendly discussion quickly escalated into personal attacks, with each man determined to prove the other wrong. The entire room became uncomfortable as these two otherwise reasonable people destroyed their relationship over economic theories that neither would remember clearly the next morning. As I watched this spectacle unfold, I thought about Lincoln facing infinitely more consequential disagreements during the Civil War. He dealt with generals who questioned his strategy, politicians who challenged his policies, and cabinet members who sometimes openly opposed his decisions. Yet somehow, he managed to keep these relationships intact and productive. The secret, I realized, was that Lincoln understood a fundamental truth about human nature. No one ever really wins an argument. Even when you prove someone wrong with irrefutable facts and flawless logic, what have you actually accomplished? You've made them feel foolish, damaged their pride, and created resentment that may last for years. They may concede the point publicly, but privately they'll resent you for humiliating them. I began experimenting with this principle in my own interactions. When someone expressed a viewpoint I disagreed with, instead of launching into a counter-argument, I would say something like, "That's an interesting way to look at it. I've been thinking about this issue from a different angle. What do you think about this perspective?" Then I would share my viewpoint as an addition to the conversation rather than a contradiction of theirs. The results were astounding. People who might have become defensive and argumentative instead became curious and collaborative. Instead of digging deeper into their original position to defend their ego, they felt free to explore new ideas because I wasn't attacking their intelligence or judgment. One particularly memorable example involved a business dispute I was mediating between two partners who were on the verge of dissolving a profitable company over disagreements about expansion strategies. Rather than allowing them to present their cases and declare one right and the other wrong, I guided them to focus on their shared desire for the company's success. "Gentlemen," I said, "you both built this company because you believe in its potential. You both want it to thrive and grow. You both care about your employees and customers. The question isn't who's right about expansion, it's how we can use both of your insights to create the best possible strategy for achieving what you both want." By reframing the discussion from who's right to how can we succeed together, we transformed a relationship-destroying argument into a problem-solving session. They ended up developing a hybrid expansion strategy that incorporated the best elements of both their original ideas. This principle extends far beyond business disputes. I've seen marriages saved when couples stopped trying to win arguments about household responsibilities and started focusing on their shared goal of creating a harmonious home. I've watched parent-child relationships heal when parents stopped trying to prove they were right about every rule and started explaining how those rules served the family's common values. The hardest part of implementing this principle is overcoming our natural desire to be right. We're taught from childhood that being right is important, that we should defend our positions and prove our points. But what I've learned is that being right is far less important than being effective. Would you rather win an argument or win respect? Would you rather prove your point or solve the problem? Lincoln understood that his job wasn't to be right, was to preserve the Union. Every decision, every conversation, Every interaction was filtered through that larger purpose. When we have a clear understanding of what we're really trying to accomplish, it becomes much easier to resist the temptation to engage in pointless arguments that serve our ego, but damage our objectives. Asterisk. One of my most embarrassing moments as a young instructor taught me a lesson that would become fundamental to everything I taught about human relations. It was during my early days teaching at the YMCA, and I was so eager to demonstrate my knowledge that I made a critical error in human psychology. During a lecture on public speaking, I was quoting from the Bible to illustrate a point about powerful rhetoric. One of my students, a well-educated banker, politely interrupted me. "Mr. Carnegie," he said, "I believe you'll find that quote is from Shakespeare, not the Bible." I was absolutely certain he was wrong. I had memorized that passage years earlier, and I knew it came from the book of Job. Without thinking, I responded with the kind of blunt correction that makes people wince. "No, sir, you are wrong. That passage is definitely from the Bible. I've studied it extensively." The banker's face flushed red. He sat back in his chair, crossed his arms, and didn't participate in the discussion for the rest of the evening. Other students shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the tension I had created. The entire atmosphere of collaborative learning I had worked so hard to establish was destroyed in a single moment. The worst part came later that evening when I checked my reference books and discovered that the banker was absolutely right. The quote was indeed from Shakespeare, not the Bible. I had confused two similar passages in my memory, and, in my arrogance, I had publicly humiliated a man who was trying to help me avoid an error. I spent a sleepless night thinking about what had happened. Even if I had been right about the quote, what had I gained by making the banker feel foolish? Nothing positive. I had proven my knowledge at the expense of his dignity, and in doing so, I had lost far more than I had won. The next week, I began that class with a public apology. "Last week, I made a serious error," I told the group. "Not just in my facts, but in my approach. Mr. Williams was correct about the Shakespeare quotation, and I was wrong. But even more importantly, I was wrong to correct him so bluntly, even if I had been right about the facts. There are ways to disagree that preserve dignity and maintain relationships." What I learned from this painful experience was that the words "you're wrong" are among the most relationship-damaging phrases in the English language. They don't just challenge someone's information, they challenge their competence, their intelligence, and their... When we tell someone they're wrong, we're essentially saying, "You're not smart enough to understand this correctly." I began studying alternative ways to present conflicting information. Instead of "you're wrong," I learned to say things like, "I wonder if there might be another way to look at this," or "that's interesting. I had a different understanding. Let me share what I've learned and see what you think." The difference in people's responses was remarkable. When I avoided the direct contradiction, people remained open to new information. They didn't become defensive because I wasn't attacking their judgment. Instead of digging in to defend their original position, they became curious about the alternative perspective I was offering. I discovered that this principle worked in every area of life. When my wife Dorothy expressed an opinion I disagreed with, instead of telling her she was wrong, I would say, "That's one way to see it. I've been thinking about it differently. What do you think about this angle?" Our discussions became more collaborative and less combative. In business situations, this approach was even more powerful. When a client had misconceptions about our services, I learned to say, "Many people have that same understanding. Let me share some additional information that might be helpful." This preserved their dignity while providing the correct information. The key insight is that people don't resist new information, they resist being made to feel foolish. When we present alternative viewpoints as additions to the conversation rather than corrections of their mistakes, people welcome the new perspective instead of fighting it. Even when dealing with clear, factual errors, I found gentler approaches. that preserved relationships while conveying accurate information. Phrases like, "I may be mistaken, but I thought," or "could it be that," allowed people to save face while considering new information. This principle requires humility and genuine respect for others' intelligence. It means approaching disagreements with curiosity rather than certainty, with the goal of mutual understanding rather than personal vindication. It transforms conversations from battlefields where someone must lose into collaborative explorations, where everyone can learn. The principle of admitting mistakes quickly came to me through what could have been a career-ending humiliation, but instead became one of my greatest learning experiences. It happened during my early days on radio, when I was hosting a program called the Dale Carnegie Hour. Radio was still relatively new, and I was nervous about reaching such a large audience. During one particular broadcast, I was discussing the importance of accurate information in public speaking. To illustrate my point, I shared what I believed was a fascinating historical fact about Benjamin Franklin's role in the Declaration of Independence. I spoke with complete confidence, weaving the story into my larger message about credibility and research. Within hours of the broadcast, my office was flooded with letters and phone calls from listeners pointing out that my historical fact was completely incorrect. Not only had I gotten the basic facts wrong, but I had done so while lecturing about the importance of accuracy. The irony was painful, and my first instinct was to find ways to deflect or minimize the error. I spent an entire night wrestling with my wounded pride. I could have quietly corrected the information in future broadcasts, hoping most listeners wouldn't notice. I could have blamed my research assistant or claimed the error was in my notes. I could have found technical ways to justify what I had said, but something inside me rebelled against these face-saving approaches. The next week, I began my radio program with these words: "Last week, I made a significant error when discussing Benjamin Franklin's role in the Declaration of Independence. Several knowledgeable listeners have written to correct me, and they are absolutely right. I was wrong, and I want to thank those who took the time to educate me." This mistake perfectly illustrates the very point I was trying to make: the importance of thorough research and intellectual humility. The response was extraordinary. Instead of damaging my credibility, my admission of error actually enhanced it. Listeners wrote to express their appreciation for my honesty. They said my willingness to admit mistakes made them trust me more, not less. Several people commented that they had gained more respect for me from that moment of vulnerability than from months of polished presentations. This experience taught me that admitting mistakes quickly and honestly has an almost magical effect on relationships and conflicts. When we acknowledge our errors immediately, several powerful things happen simultaneously. First, it disarms criticism. When you admit your mistake before others point it out, you remove their ability to attack you for it. You've already done their work for them, and done it more thoroughly than they ever could. Critics find themselves in the awkward position of agreeing with you rather than opposing you. Second, it demonstrates strength, not weakness. Anyone can make excuses or deflect blame. It takes real courage and confidence to say, "I was wrong." People respect that honesty and often interpret it as a sign of integrity and self-assurance. Third, it creates connection rather than division. When you admit mistakes, you reveal your humanity. You become someone others can relate to rather than someone they need to defend against. This vulnerability often inspires others to be more honest about their own imperfections. I began applying this principle in all areas of my life. When I said something insensitive to Dorothy, instead of explaining why she had misunderstood me, I would immediately say, "I'm sorry. That came out wrong, and I can see how it hurt your feelings." These quick acknowledgments prevented small misunderstandings from becoming major arguments. In business situations, I found that admitting mistakes quickly often turned potential disasters into opportunities for stronger relationships. When I made an error in scheduling that inconvenienced a client, instead of making excuses about my busy schedule, I said, "I made a mistake with the scheduling, and I apologize for the inconvenience. Let me make this right." The client was so impressed with my direct accountability that he actually increased his business with me. The key is to admit mistakes before you're forced to, and to do so completely without conditions or excuses. Don't say, "I made a mistake," but ... Just say, "I made a mistake." Don't explain all the circumstances that led to the error. Don't point out how unusual it was for you to make such a mistake. Simply acknowledge it, apologize if appropriate, and move forward. This principle requires us to prioritize our relationships and objectives over our ego. It means valuing truth and trust more than our image of perfection. When we can admit our mistakes quickly and gracefully, we actually become more influential and respected, not less. The power of beginning difficult conversations in a friendly manner became crystal clear to me through an experience that could have ended in a costly legal battle, but instead resulted in an unexpected friendship. This happened during my early years in New York, when I was renting a small apartment on the Upper West Side. My landlord, Mr. Antonelli, was a stern Italian immigrant who owned several buildings in the neighborhood. He had a reputation for being rigid about lease terms and quick to take tenants to court over disputes. When a water pipe burst in my bathroom due to old plumbing, causing significant damage to my personal belongings, I knew we were headed for a confrontation. The lease clearly stated that tenants were responsible for any water damage, regardless of the cause. Mr. Antonelli's initial position was that I owed him for repairs to the bathroom and the apartment below. Plus, I was responsible for replacing my own damaged items. According to the lease, he was technically correct, but the pipe had failed due to age and poor maintenance, not anything I had done. My first instinct was to march into his office with legal arguments, threatening to fight the charges and demanding that he take responsibility for maintaining his property properly. I had my arguments prepared, my righteous indignation fueled, and my determination set to prove that he was being unreasonable. But something made me pause and consider a different approach. Instead of beginning with confrontation, what if I started with understanding and friendship? What if I treated Mr. Antonelli not as an adversary to be defeated, but as a reasonable person facing a difficult situation? I knocked on his office door with a completely different attitude. "Mr. Antonelli," I began with a genuine smile, "I wanted to thank you for responding so quickly to the water pipe emergency yesterday. I know these old buildings present constant challenges, and I appreciate how hard you work to maintain them." Watched his defensive posture soften immediately. He had been braced for an attack, and instead, he was receiving appreciation and understanding. "It's true," he said, relaxing into his chair. "These buildings, they are always something. The pipes, the heat, the roof, always something needs fixing." We spent several minutes discussing the challenges of maintaining old buildings in New York. I shared my appreciation for the character and charm of older apartments, and he told me stories about the building's history and his experiences as a property owner. By the time we addressed the water damage issue, we were no longer adversaries. We were two people working together to solve a mutual problem. "Mr. Carnegie," he said finally, "this pipe, it was old, maybe 40 years old. You didn't do nothing wrong. I tell you what, pay for the repairs, and you just pay for whatever your insurance doesn't cover for your things. Fair." The friendly beginning had transformed a potential legal battle into a collaborative solution. More importantly, it began a relationship that lasted for years. Mr. Antonelli became not just a landlord, but a friend who looked out for my welfare and even helped me find a better apartment when I was ready to move. This experience taught me that the emotional tone we set in the first few moments of any difficult conversation often determines the entire outcome. When we begin with hostility, defensiveness, or aggression, we trigger the same responses in others. When we begin with warmth, understanding, and friendliness, we create an atmosphere where problems can be solved rather than battles fought. I began applying this principle systematically. Before entering any potentially difficult conversation, I would spend a few moments thinking about the other person's perspective and finding something genuine to appreciate about them or their situation. This wasn't manipulation, it was a sincere effort to connect with their humanity before addressing our differences. When I had to give difficult feedback to my students, I would begin by acknowledging something they were doing well and expressing my confidence in their potential. When Dorothy and I needed to discuss household budget concerns, I would start by expressing appreciation for how hard she worked to manage our home efficiently. The key insight is that friendly beginnings lower everyone's defenses and create psychological safety for honest communication. When people feel attacked or threatened, their minds automatically shift into defensive mode, making rational discussion nearly impossible. When they feel respected and valued, they remain open to new information and alternative perspectives. This doesn't mean being false or manipulative. It means recognizing that every person deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, especially when we disagree with them. It means approaching others with genuine curiosity about their perspective rather than determination to prove them wrong. A friendly beginning sends a powerful message. I see you as a worthy person, and I believe we can work together to resolve this issue. That message opens doors that confrontation would slam shut forever. Asterisk. The power of questions over statements revealed itself to me through my study of Socrates and his revolutionary teaching method, but it became personally meaningful during a challenging situation with one of my most stubborn students. James was a successful businessman who had enrolled in my public speaking course, but seemed determined to resist every suggestion I offered. When I would say, "It's important to make eye contact with your audience," James would argue that in his industry, people found direct eye contact aggressive. When I suggested varying vocal tone for emphasis, he insisted that his clients preferred straightforward, monotone delivery. Every principle I taught, he had a reason why it didn't apply to his unique situation. My initial approach was to counter his objections with stronger statements. I would explain more forcefully why eye contact was essential, provide more evidence for vocal variety, and cite more examples of successful speakers who used these techniques. The more I pushed, the more he resisted. Our sessions became tense debates rather than productive learning experiences. Then I remembered reading about Socrates and his method of teaching through questions rather than declarations. Instead of telling people what to think, Socrates would ask questions that led them to discover truth for themselves. People rarely argued with conclusions they had reached through their own reasoning. I decided to experiment with this approach in my next session with James. Instead of telling him what to do differently, I began asking him questions about his own speaking experiences. "James," I said, "think about the most persuasive speaker you've ever heard. When he was talking to you, where were his eyes focused?" James paused, considering. "Well, he was looking right at me. Made me feel like I was the only person in the room." "Interesting. And how did that make you feel about what he was saying?" "More connected to it, I suppose. Like he really cared whether I understood." "What do you think would happen if you created that same feeling of connection with your clients?" I watched as James worked through the logic himself. He wasn't defending against my assertions because I wasn't making any. Instead, he was exploring his own experiences and drawing his own conclusions. Within minutes, he was asking me for specific techniques to improve his eye contact, the same techniques he had resisted when I presented them as directives. This breakthrough transformed my entire teaching approach. Instead of saying, "You should speak more slowly," I would ask, "What happens to your audience's comprehension when you speak very quickly?" Instead of declaring, "Your gestures need to be more natural," I would inquire, when you're talking with your family at home, how do your hands move differently than they do up here? The results were remarkable. Students who had been defensive and argumentative became collaborative and eager to improve. They stopped seeing my suggestions as criticisms and started viewing them as opportunities for discovery. More importantly, the insights they gained through questioning stuck with them longer because they had participated in reaching those conclusions. I began applying this principle in all my relationships. When Dorothy and I disagreed about household decisions, instead of stating my position and defending it, I would ask questions. What concerns you most about this approach? What would an ideal solution accomplish for both of us? What other options haven't we considered? These questions accomplished several important things simultaneously. They showed genuine interest in her perspective. They encouraged her to think more deeply about the issue, and they often revealed information that changed my own understanding of the situation. In business relationships, questions proved even more powerful than persuasive arguments. When potential clients expressed skepticism about my courses, instead of launching into sales presentations about the benefits, I would ask, what results would make this investment worthwhile for you? What challenges are you facing in your current communication? What's worked well for you in the past when learning new skills? Their answers gave me exactly the information I needed to present my services in terms that mattered to them. More importantly, by talking through their needs and goals, they often convinced themselves that they needed what I was offering. The key insight is that questions engage people's minds differently than statements. When we make statements, people evaluate whether they agree or disagree with us. When we ask thoughtful questions, people explore their own thoughts and experiences. They become active participants in the conversation rather than passive judges of our ideas. Questions also demonstrate respect for others' intelligence and experience. They show that we value their perspective and believe they have insights worth exploring. This respect creates an atmosphere of collaboration rather than competition. The most powerful questions are those that help people discover inconsistencies in their own thinking or connections they hadn't previously made. How does that align with your earlier statement about ... What might someone who disagreed with you say about that? If you were advising someone else in this situation, what would you recommend? Through questions, we become guides rather than adversaries, helping others navigate their way to new understanding rather than trying to force them to accept our conclusions. One of the most delicate and important principles I learned came through a heartbreaking situation that taught me the critical importance of preserving others' dignity, even when delivering difficult news. This lesson emerged during my time as a corporate training consultant when I was asked to help a company address a serious performance issue with a long-term employee. Margaret had worked for the company for 15 years as a bookkeeper. She was well-liked, dependable, and had been competent throughout most of her tenure. However, as the business grew and technology evolved, her skills had not kept pace. She was making increasingly frequent errors, and the new, computerized systems confused her. The company needed someone with more advanced skills, but Margaret's supervisor was struggling with how to handle the situation. "I don't know how to tell her she's not cutting it anymore," he confided in me. "She's given us 15 good years, and she really needs this job, but I can't keep covering for her mistakes. What do I do?" My first instinct was to suggest a direct, honest conversation about her performance deficiencies. After all, clarity is important, and she deserved to know where she stood. But as I thought more deeply about the situation, I realized that a blunt assessment of her inadequacies would be devastating, not just professionally, but personally. Margaret's identity was wrapped up in being a competent, reliable employee. Her self-worth was connected to her ability to contribute meaningfully to the company. To directly tell her she was failing would crush something essential in her spirit, even if it was necessary for the business. Instead, I suggested an approach that would allow Margaret to maintain her dignity while addressing the company's needs. The supervisor would have a conversation with her about the company's growth and evolving requirements, positioning the changes as organizational development rather than personal failure. "Margaret," he said when they met, "I wanted to talk with you about how much the company has changed since you started here 15 years ago. Your reliability and dedication have been constants through all these transitions, and I really appreciate that. Now we're facing another evolution with these new computer systems and expanded responsibilities. I'm wondering if you might be interested in a different role that would make better use of your strengths while allowing us to bring in someone with more recent technology training for the bookkeeping position." The conversation continued with genuine appreciation for her contributions and exploration of other positions where her experience and reliability would be valuable. Margaret was able to transition to a customer service role that better suited her skills, and she felt like she was being promoted to address customer needs rather than demoted for inadequate performance. The outcome was remarkable. Margaret thrived in her new position. The company got the technical skills they needed in bookkeeping, and the transition preserved important relationships and morale throughout the organization. Most importantly, Margaret's dignity and self-worth remained intact. This experience taught me that allowing people to save face isn't just about being kind, it's about being effective. When we damage someone's self-respect, we create long-term resentment and resistance that can poison relationships and outcomes for years to come. When we preserve their dignity, we maintain their cooperation and goodwill. I began applying this principle in every situation where correction or criticism was necessary. When students made mistakes in my classes, instead of highlighting their errors, I would focus on what they were doing well and suggest ways to build on those strengths. "John, your passion for the topic really came through. I think if you slowed down just a bit, your natural enthusiasm would be even more compelling to the audience." With Dorothy, I learned to address household concerns without attacking her judgment or competence. Instead of saying, "You're not managing the household budget effectively," I might say, "I've been thinking about our finances, and I wonder if we might explore some different approaches to help us reach our savings goals more quickly." In business situations, this principle was especially valuable when negotiating or resolving conflicts. Instead of proving the other party wrong, I would find ways to acknowledge their valid concerns while introducing new information. "You're absolutely right that cost is a major consideration. I've been thinking about that same issue, and I've found some approaches that might address your budget concerns while still meeting your quality requirements." The key is to separate the person from the problem. You can disagree with someone's position without attacking their intelligence. You can correct someone's information without implying they're incompetent. You can solve problems without making anyone feel foolish for not having solved them already. This requires creativity and genuine care for others' welfare. It means thinking beyond the immediate issue to consider the long-term relationship. It means asking yourself, not just how can I get what I want, but how can we both get what we need while maintaining mutual respect. Letting others save face often involves finding ways to share responsibility for problems or to frame solutions as collaborative discoveries rather than individual corrections. It means being generous with credit and sparing with blame, understanding that preserved dignity leads to preserved relationships and future cooperation. Asterisk. The principle of finding common ground before addressing differences came to life for me during one of the most challenging assignments of my consulting career, mediating a bitter labor dispute that had paralyzed a manufacturing company for 3 weeks. Both management and the union representatives had dug into entrenched positions, and their meetings had devolved into shouting matches that accomplished nothing except deepening the animosity. When I arrived at the plant, the atmosphere was toxic. Workers were picketing outside while management huddled in conference rooms. Each side convinced the other was being completely unreasonable. The union wanted significant wage increases and better working conditions. Management insisted they couldn't afford the demands without making the company uncompetitive. Both sides spoke as if they were natural enemies with completely incompatible interests. My first meeting with both groups together lasted less than 10 minutes before voices were raised and accusations were flying. The union representative accused management of caring only about profits while exploiting workers. The plant manager responded by questioning the union's understanding of business realities. I realized that trying to address their specific disagreements while emotions were running so high would be futile. Instead, I asked both groups to take a step back and help me understand something fundamental. Why does this company exist? What is its purpose? This simple question shifted the entire dynamic of the conversation. The union representative spoke first. Well, it provides good jobs for working families in this community. People depend on this place to support their children and build their lives. The plant manager nodded. That's right. And we're also providing products that people need, contributing to the local economy, and building something we can all be proud of. As they continued talking, something remarkable happened. They began to discover that underneath their surface disagreements lay profound shared values. Both sides wanted the company to be successful and sustainable. Both cared about the workers and their families. Both took pride in the quality of their products. Both wanted to be part of something meaningful that contributed to the community. Once we had established this common ground, the entire tone of the negotiations changed. Instead of adversaries fighting over a fixed pie, they became partners trying to solve shared challenges. The union's wage demands were reframed as investment in the skilled workforce that made the company competitive. Management's cost concerns were understood as ensuring the company's survival, so it could continue providing stable employment, working from this foundation of shared values. They developed creative solutions that neither side had previously considered. They agreed to profit-sharing arrangements that aligned everyone's interests with the company's success. They implemented training programs that improved working conditions while increasing productivity. They established joint committees to address ongoing concerns. Collaboratively rather than adversarially, the settlement was reached within 2 days of shifting the focus to common ground, ending a dispute that had seemed intractable just hours earlier. More importantly, the relationship between management and labor remained strong for years afterward because it was built on recognized mutual interests rather than mere compromise between opposing positions. This experience revolutionized my approach to conflict resolution in every area of life. Before addressing any disagreement, I learned to identify and emphasize the values, goals, and interests that all parties shared. This simple shift in sequence agreement before disagreement made even the most difficult conversations more productive. When Dorothy and I faced decisions about our household or our future, I would begin by reminding us both of our shared love for each other and our common goals for our life together. We both want a home where we feel peaceful and happy. We both want to be wise with our money so we can enjoy security and also be generous with others. Given those shared values, how do we think about this decision? In business situations, I found that identifying common ground early in conversations prevented many conflicts from escalating when negotiating with potential clients. Instead of immediately addressing their objections to my services, I would explore our shared desire for their success and growth. This created a collaborative atmosphere where we could work together to find solutions rather than battle over terms. The key insight is that people become defensive when they feel their fundamental values or goals are being attacked. When we start by acknowledging and affirming the values we share, we create psychological safety that allows for honest discussion of tactical differences. We transform the conversation from us versus them to us versus the problem. Finding common ground requires genuine curiosity about others' underlying motivations and concerns. It means looking beyond surface positions to understand the deeper needs and values that drive people's behavior. It means approaching conflicts with the assumption that reasonable people can have different ideas about how to achieve shared goals. This principle works because it appeals to our fundamental human desire for connection and cooperation. When we feel understood and valued by others, we become more willing to understand and accommodate their perspectives in return. Asterisk, the transformative power of truly listening during conflict became clear to me through an incident that could have destroyed an important business relationship, but instead strengthened it immeasurably. This happened during my early years running training programs for corporations. When I encountered one of the angriest customers I had ever faced, Mr. Patterson had enrolled his entire sales team in one of my courses, expecting dramatic improvements in their performance. When the results didn't meet his unrealistic expectations within the first month, he stormed into my office in a fury that was both intimidating and heartbreaking to witness. "Carnegie," he shouted, barely through my door, "your program is worthless. My people are no better than they were before, and I've wasted thousands of dollars on your fancy theories. You've promised results, and you've delivered nothing but disappointment. I want my money back, and I'm going to make sure every business owner in this city knows what a fraud you are." My initial impulse was to defend my program, to explain why his expectations were unreasonable, to point out the progress his team had actually made, and to protect my reputation from his threats. Every fiber of my being wanted to interrupt his tirade and set the record straight. But something deeper told me that this man wasn't really angry about training programs. He was in pain about something much more fundamental. Instead of defending myself, I did something that surprised us both. I listened, really listened. Not the kind of listening where you're waiting for your turn to speak, but the kind where you're genuinely trying to understand what the other person is experiencing. "Mr. Patterson," I said quietly when he paused for breath, "you sound incredibly frustrated and disappointed. This clearly matters a great deal to you. Help me understand what's really going on." The invitation to be heard seemed to crack something open in him. His voice became less aggressive and more vulnerable as he continued. "Dale, I'm fighting for my business's survival. My competitors are beating me in every market. My best customers are leaving, and I thought your training would be the answer. I'm running out of options, and I'm scared that I'm going to lose everything I've worked 20 years to build." As he spoke, I began to see past his anger to the fear and desperation driving it. This wasn't really about my training program. It was about a man watching his life's work crumble and desperately searching for someone to blame or something to save him. His attack on me was actually a cry for help. I continued listening, asking gentle questions that helped him explore his deeper concerns. "What's been the most challenging part of competing in your market? When did you first notice these changes? What approaches have you tried before bringing your team to me?" For the next hour, Mr. Patterson shared his story. The changing marketplace, the younger competitors with new approaches, his fear that his traditional methods were becoming obsolete, his worry about disappointing the employees who depended on him. The more he talked, the clearer it became that his real need wasn't to blame someone for his problems, it was to find genuine solutions. By the end of our conversation, we had identified specific ways to adapt my training to address his unique market challenges. More importantly, we had developed a collaborative relationship built on mutual understanding and respect. "Mr. Patterson," became one of my most loyal clients and eventually one of my closest friends. This experience taught me that angry people don't need to be corrected or argued with. They need to be heard. Behind every furious outburst is a person who feels unheard, misunderstood, or threatened in some fundamental way. When we truly listen to their concerns, we often discover that their anger isn't really directed at us personally. It's their way of expressing pain or fear about something deeper. I learned to recognize the difference between listening to respond and listening to understand. When we listen to respond, we're gathering ammunition for our counterargument. When we listen to understand, we're seeking to grasp the real concerns and emotions behind the words. Listening during heated moments requires enormous self-discipline. It means setting aside our ego and our need to be right in order to focus completely on the other person's experience. It means asking questions that help them explore their feelings rather than questions that lead them toward our preferred conclusions. The physical aspects of listening are crucial during conflicts. I learned to maintain open body language, make appropriate eye contact, and resist the urge to interrupt or become defensive. Sometimes, the most powerful thing I could say was nothing at all, just creating space for the other person to fully express their concerns. True listening during conflict also involves reflecting back what you've heard to ensure understanding. So, if I understand correctly, your main concern is ... or it sounds like you're feeling ... These reflections show that you're taking their concerns seriously and help clarify any misunderstandings. The healing power of being truly heard cannot be overstated. When people feel that their concerns have been acknowledged and understood, their defensive anger often melts away, replaced by willingness to collaborate on solutions. They stop seeing you as an adversary and start seeing you as someone who cares about their welfare. Asterisk, perhaps the most difficult aspect of staying calm in arguments is managing your own emotional responses when others are attacking your ideas, your character, or your competence. This challenge became intensely personal for me during a period when I was facing severe criticism from some academic colleagues who questioned the scientific validity of my teaching methods. Several psychology professors had written scathing reviews of my work, suggesting that my approaches were simplistic, unscientific, and potentially harmful. They questioned my qualifications, criticized my methods, and implied that I was misleading people with false promises. Reading these attacks felt like physical blows to my sense of professional identity and personal worth. My initial emotional response was a mixture of rage, hurt, and indignation. I wanted to fire back with equally harsh criticism of their theoretical approaches that helped no one in the real world. I drafted angry letters defending my work and attacking their ivory tower perspectives. I lay awake nights, planning devastating responses that would expose their hypocrisy and vindicate my methods. But I had learned enough about human nature by then to recognize what was happening to me. My anger was not really about their criticism, it was about my fear that they might be right, my insecurity about my lack of formal academic credentials, and my terror that my life's work might indeed be worthless. The intensity of my emotional reaction told me more about my own vulnerabilities than about the validity of their complaints. I began keeping what I called my anger journal, documenting my emotional patterns and triggers with the same scientific rigor I applied to studying other people's behavior. What I discovered was both humbling and enlightening. My anger followed predictable patterns. It was always strongest when criticism touched on my deepest insecurities, my education, my background, my worthiness to teach others. It was amplified when I was tired, stressed, or feeling overwhelmed by other pressures, and it was most destructive when I felt isolated and unsupported. More importantly, I noticed that my anger always peaked within the first few minutes of encountering criticism. then gradually subsided if I didn't feed it with rehearsing grievances or planning counterattacks. This observation led me to develop what I called the 24-hour rule. I would never respond to criticism or provocation within 24 hours of receiving it. During that cooling-off period, I would engage in specific practices to manage my emotional state. First, I would acknowledge my feelings without judging them. I'm feeling angry and hurt right now. That's a normal human response to criticism. This self-compassion prevented me from adding shame about my emotions to the original hurt. Second, I would examine the criticism for any valid points, even if they were embedded in unfair attacks. This required setting aside my wounded ego to honestly evaluate whether there might be truth in their observations that could help me improve my work. Third, I would remind myself of my larger purpose and values. Was I trying to win arguments with academics, or was I trying to help people improve their lives? Was I defending my ego, or was I serving my mission? This perspective shift often revealed that the criticism, however painful, was irrelevant to my real objectives. Fourth, I would consider the source and motivation of the criticism. Were these people genuinely concerned about helping others, or were they protecting their own academic territory? Understanding their possible motivations helped me respond to their real concerns, rather than just their surface attacks. The physical management of anger proved equally important. I learned to recognize the early warning signs: tension in my jaw, shallow breathing, a feeling of heat in my chest, to intervene before the emotion could hijack my judgment. Deep breathing exercises, physical movement, and sometimes just stepping away from the situation would help restore my emotional equilibrium. Perhaps most importantly, I developed a personal mantra that I would repeat when feeling attacked. This is about them, not about me. Their criticism reveals their own fears and insecurities. I can respond with compassion rather than defensiveness. When I finally did respond to my academic critics, it was with curiosity rather than hostility. I thanked them for their concerns, acknowledged the valid points in their criticism, and invited them to collaborate on research that might bridge the gap between academic theory and practical application. Several of these exchanges led to productive, ongoing relationships that improved both their work and mine. This experience taught me that managing anger isn't about suppressing or eliminating the emotion. It's about creating space between the trigger and your response. In that space lies your power to choose how you want to show up in the world, regardless of how others are treating you. The goal isn't to never feel angry, but to never let anger make your decisions for you. When you can pause, breathe, and choose your response based on your values rather than your emotions, you maintain your power and dignity while often achieving far better outcomes than reactive anger ever could. Asterisk. The most powerful de-escalation technique I ever witnessed came not from a trained mediator or counselor, but from a courtroom lawyer who transformed a potentially explosive situation into a moment of unexpected grace. I was observing legal proceedings as part of my research into persuasion and conflict resolution when I saw this masterful demonstration of calm energy in action. The case involved a bitter divorce with significant financial stakes. The estranged husband had become increasingly agitated as his ex-wife's lawyer presented evidence of hidden assets. Finally, he exploded, jumping to his feet and shouting accusations of lies and manipulation. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Everyone expected the situation to spiral into chaos. But the opposing lawyer, a soft-spoken man named William Morrison, did something remarkable. Instead of responding to the attack with equal force or demanding order, he simply stood quietly, maintained gentle eye contact, and waited. His calm presence seemed to create a pocket of stillness in the midst of the storm. When the shouting subsided, Morrison spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I can see this is incredibly painful for you. Divorce is one of the most difficult, experiences anyone can face. And I imagine you're feeling overwhelmed right now. Would it help if we took a brief recess so you can collect yourself? The effect was immediate and profound. The angry man's defensive posture melted, his voice dropped, and tears appeared in his eyes. What could have become a destructive confrontation became a moment of human connection. The recess allowed emotions to cool, and when proceedings resumed, the atmosphere was completely different. I studied that interaction for years afterward, analyzing what made it so effective. Morrison had demonstrated several crucial principles of de-escalation that I began incorporating into my own work and teaching. First, he matched his energy to the outcome he wanted, not to the energy being directed at him. When someone is shouting, our natural tendency is to shout back. When someone is aggressive, we become defensive. Morrison showed that we can choose to respond with the emotional tone that serves the situation best, regardless of how others are behaving. Second, he acknowledged the person's emotional experience without accepting blame or agreeing with their accusations. He didn't say, "You're right, we are lying." He said, "I can see this is painful for you." This validation of feelings without validation of behavior is a crucial distinction in de-escalation. Third, he offered a face-saving way for the person to step back from their aggressive position. The suggestion of a recess gave the angry man permission to calm down without appearing weak or admitting he was wrong. I began experimenting with these principles in my own challenging situations. When faced with angry students, upset clients, or heated family discussions, I would consciously lower my voice, slow my speech, and focus on creating calm energy rather than matching the intensity around me. The physical aspects of de-escalation proved equally important. I learned to keep my hands visible and open, maintain relaxed posture, and resist the urge to cross my arms or make defensive gestures. My facial expression needed to convey concern and interest rather than judgment or irritation. Verbal de-escalation techniques became a crucial part of my toolkit. Phrases like, "Help me understand your concern," or "What would need to happen for you to feel better about this situation?" shifted conversations from adversarial to collaborative. Questions like, "What's the most important thing for you in resolving this?" helped identify underlying needs that could be addressed constructively. One particularly effective technique was what I called emotional labeling, simply naming what I observed in the other person's emotional state. "You seem really frustrated about this," or "I can hear how important this is to you," had an almost magical calming effect. When people feel seen and understood in their emotional experience, they often naturally begin to regulate themselves. Timing became crucial in de-escalation. I learned to recognize the peak of someone's emotional intensity and avoid trying to reason with them during that peak. Instead, I would focus on emotional acknowledgement and creating space for the feelings to subside naturally before attempting problem solving. The power of strategic silence also became clear. Sometimes the most de-escalating thing I could do was simply stop talking and create space for the other person's emotions to run their course. Trying to fill every silence with explanations or justifications often kept conflicts escalated longer than necessary. Perhaps most importantly, I learned that successful de-escalation required genuine care for the other person's welfare. Techniques and strategies only worked when they came from authentic concern for finding solutions that served everyone involved. When people sensed that I truly wanted to understand and help rather than just win or control, they became much more willing to work with me toward resolution. The goal of de-escalation isn't to win the argument or prove you're right, it's to create conditions where real communication and problem solving can occur. When emotions are running high, rational discussion is impossible. By helping others return to a calmer state, you create opportunities for the kind of productive dialogue that actually resolves conflicts rather than just temporarily suppressing them. Asterisk. The most remarkable transformation I ever witnessed from conflict to collaboration involved a situation that initially appeared to be a disaster for my business. A competitor had publicly criticized my methods and was actively trying to steal my clients by claiming his approach was more scientific and effective than mine. What began as a threat to my livelihood eventually became one of the most profitable partnerships of my career. Dr. Frederick Stevenson was a university-trained psychologist who had started offering corporate training programs that directly competed with mine. He had impressive academic credentials and a sophisticated understanding of behavioral psychology that made my practical, common-sense approaches seem simplistic by comparison. When he began approaching my clients with presentations that highlighted the supposed deficiencies in my methods, I felt both angry and threatened. My initial impulse was to fight back, to expose the weaknesses in his theoretical approach, to point out his lack of real-world experience, and to defend my track record of practical results. I began preparing competitive presentations that would demonstrate why my methods were superior to his academic theories. But as I worked on these defensive materials, I realized I was falling into the same trap I had been teaching others to avoid. I was treating this situation as a zero-sum competition where one of us had to lose for the other to win. What if, instead, I approached it as an opportunity to create something better than either of us could accomplish alone? I decided to reach out to Dr. Stevenson directly, but not in the way he might have expected. Instead of challenging him to a public debate or demanding that he stop criticizing my work, I invited him to lunch to discuss our shared interest in helping people improve their communication skills. Dr. Stevenson, I said when we met, I've been following your work with great interest. Your understanding of psychological principles is clearly far more sophisticated than mine. I'm curious, what do you see as the biggest challenges in helping people actually apply psychological insights in their daily lives? This question shifted our entire dynamic. Instead of defending his theoretical approach against my practical methods, he began exploring the genuine challenge of bridging the gap between academic knowledge and real-world application. As we talked, it became clear that we each possessed something the other needed. His deep understanding of psychological principles could provide the scientific foundation that my methods sometimes lacked. My experience in practical application could help his theories become accessible and usable for ordinary people. Rather than competing for the same market, we could create a more comprehensive approach that served clients better than either of our individual offerings. What if, I suggested, instead of trying to prove whose approach is superior, we collaborated on developing training programs that combine the best of both our approaches? Your theoretical expertise with my practical experience could create something neither of us could achieve alone. The conversation that followed was one of the most intellectually stimulating I had ever experienced. We discovered that many of our apparent disagreements were actually differences in emphasis rather than fundamental conflicts. He valued scientific rigor. I valued practical results. He focused on understanding why techniques worked. I focused on making sure they worked in real situations. Over the following months, we developed a partnership that transformed both our businesses. We created training programs that were both psychologically sound and practically effective. His academic credibility enhanced the reputation of our combined offerings, while my practical experience ensured that participants could actually apply what they learned. More importantly, our collaboration attracted clients who had been skeptical of either approach alone. Companies that found my methods too simplistic were impressed by the psychological sophistication we brought together. Organizations that found his approach to theoretical appreciated the practical implementation strategies we provided. This experience taught me that many conflicts contain hidden opportunities for mutual benefit. When we stop seeing disagreement as a threat and start viewing it as a chance to learn and improve, we often discover possibilities that neither party had previously imagined. The key insight is that most arguments arise not from truly incompatible interests, but from different perspectives on how to achieve similar goals. Dr. Stevenson and I both wanted to help people communicate more effectively. Our initial conflict arose from our different beliefs about the best methods for achieving that shared objective. I began applying this principle to other conflicts in my life. When Dorothy and I disagreed about household decisions, instead of arguing about whose approach was right, I would ask, what are we both trying to accomplish here? How might we combine our ideas to create a solution that's better than either of our original proposals? In business negotiations, I started looking for ways to expand the pie, rather than just fighting over how to divide it. When clients objected to my fees, instead of defending my prices or reducing them, I would explore how we might structure arrangements that provided them more value while still meeting my financial needs. The transformation from adversarial to collaborative thinking requires a fundamental shift in mindset. Instead of asking, how can I win this argument? We must ask, how can we both get what we really need? Instead of defending our positions, we must explore our underlying interests and look for creative ways to satisfy them. This approach doesn't work in every situation. Sometimes interests truly are incompatible, but more often than we realize, apparent conflicts are actually opportunities for innovation and mutual benefit, waiting for someone with the vision and courage to reframe the conversation from competition to collaboration. Asterisk. The true test of any conflict resolution approach isn't whether it prevents arguments, it's whether relationships emerge stronger after difficult conversations have ended. This principle became deeply personal for me through a painful confrontation with my closest friend that nearly destroyed a friendship I treasured, but ultimately taught me invaluable lessons about post-conflict relationship repair. Frank Robinson and I had been friends since our college days. We had supported each other through career struggles, celebrated each other's successes, and maintained a close friendship even as our lives took different directions. Frank had become a successful banker while I pursued my unconventional career in human relations training. The conflict arose when Frank made some deeply hurtful comments about my work during a dinner party with mutual friends. He suggested that my training programs were feel-good nonsense that gave people false hope instead of helping them develop real skills. His remarks felt like a betrayal not just of my professional work, but of our personal friendship. I confronted him privately after the party, and our conversation quickly escalated into the most heated argument we had ever had. We said things to each other that cut deep, attacking not just our professional choices, but our personal values and character. The evening ended with Frank storming out, and we didn't speak for several weeks. During that period of silence, I wrestled with my anger and hurt, while also applying the principles I had been teaching others. I realized that our friendship was more important than being right about our professional differences, but I also knew that simply apologizing or pretending the conflict hadn't happened wouldn't repair the damage we had done to each other. I spent considerable time crafting what I thought of as a reconciliation letter, not an apology for my legitimate concerns, but an acknowledgement of how I had handled those concerns and an invitation to rebuild our relationship on stronger ground. Dear Frank, I wrote, I've been thinking about our conversation, and I want to share some thoughts with you. First, I believe we both said things we regret, and I take full responsibility for my part in letting our discussion become so heated. Our friendship means far more to me than any professional disagreement ever could. I also want to acknowledge that your concerns about my work may have some validity. You've always been someone whose judgment I respect, and perhaps there are ways I could make my programs more substantial and effective. I'd value your thoughts on how to do that. What I hope we can both agree on is that we want to help people improve their lives, even if we have different ideas about the best methods. Maybe that shared goal is more important than our tactical differences. I miss our friendship, Frank, and I hope we can find a way to move forward that honors both our relationship and our honest differences of opinion. Frank's response came within days, and it was equally thoughtful and generous. He acknowledged his own mistakes in how he had expressed his concerns, validated the positive impact he had seen my work have on people we both knew, and suggested we meet to discuss how we might support each other despite our different approaches. Our reconciliation conversation became a model for how I would handle post-conflict relationship repair for the rest of my life. We established several principles that proved invaluable in similar situations. First, we acknowledged that the conflict had revealed real differences in our perspectives that deserved respect rather than dismissal. We weren't going to pretend we saw eye to eye on everything, but we could appreciate each other's viewpoints even when we didn't share them. Second, we took responsibility for our own behavior during the conflict without demanding equivalent admissions from the other person. I focused on how I could have handled things better, not on what Frank should have done differently. Third, we identified what we had learned from the conflict that could actually strengthen our relationship going forward. Our argument had revealed that we hadn't been communicating honestly about our professional concerns, and we committed to more direct, respectful dialogue in the future. Fourth, we reaffirmed the values and experiences that had originally brought us together and that remained more important than our surface disagreements. Our shared history, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's welfare were the foundation of our friendship. This experience taught me that the period immediately following a difficult conversation is crucial for relationship outcomes. Without intentional repair efforts, even resolved conflicts can leave lasting resentment and distance. But with thoughtful follow-up, conflicts can actually deepen trust and intimacy. I began making post-conflict communication a standard part of my approach to difficult conversations, whether with family members, business associates, or students. I would always follow up within a few days to check on the relationship and ensure that resolution was complete. Sometimes, this involved a simple note expressing appreciation for the other person's willingness to work through the issue. Sometimes it required acknowledging insights I had gained from their perspective. Often it meant making specific commitments about how I would handle similar situations differently in the future. The goal wasn't to eliminate all future conflicts. That would be impossible and even undesirable. The goal was to establish patterns of repair and reconnection that made our relationships more resilient and trustworthy over time. Frank and I never had another conflict as heated as that first one, partly because we had learned to address concerns more skillfully, but mostly because we both knew that even serious disagreements couldn't threaten the fundamental strength of our friendship. Asterisk, as I reflect on a lifetime of studying human relations and teaching others how to navigate conflict with grace, I am struck by a collection of letters that arrived at my office over the years. Letters from people whose lives were transformed not by grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but by simple applications of the principles we've discussed together. One letter that particularly moved me came from a woman named Helen, a schoolteacher who had attended one of my courses during a particularly difficult period in her career. She wrote, "Mr. Carnegie, I wanted you to know that the principles you taught about staying calm in arguments didn't just change how I handle conflicts. They changed who I am as a person. Last year, I was known as the teacher who argued with parents, who fought with administrators, and who created tension wherever I went. I thought I was standing up for what was right, but I was actually destroying the very relationships I needed to help my students. After applying your principles for 6 months, parents began seeking me out for advice. Administrators started including me in important decisions. Most importantly, my students began trusting me with their problems because they saw how I handled disagreements with respect and calm. I didn't just become a better teacher, became the kind of person others turn to when they need wisdom and peace. Helen's letter represents hundreds of similar testimonials I received over the years from people who discovered that learning to stay calm in arguments was really learning to lead with quiet strength and dignity. They found that when you refuse to be drawn into destructive conflicts, when you respond to aggression with composure, and when you seek understanding rather than victory, you become a different kind of person, someone others naturally respect and trust. That this transformation creates what I call a legacy of calm leadership that extends far beyond your individual interactions. When you consistently model peaceful conflict resolution, you give others permission to do the same. You create an atmosphere around you where problems can be solved rather than battles fought, where relationships can be strengthened rather than damaged by disagreement. I've watched this ripple effect play out countless times. A manager who learns to handle workplace conflicts with composure finds that her entire team begins communicating more respectfully with each other. A parent who stops arguing with their children and starts listening to their concerns discovers that the whole family becomes more harmonious. A husband who applies these principles in his marriage finds that he and his wife begin approaching all their challenges as partners rather than adversaries. The principles we've explored together, avoiding arguments, never telling people they're wrong, admitting mistakes quickly, beginning in friendship, asking questions instead of making statements, letting others save face, finding common ground, listening deeply, managing your own emotions, de-escalating conflicts, turning arguments into opportunities, and repairing relationships after difficult conversations. These aren't just techniques for handling specific situations. They're a way of being in the world that attracts cooperation, builds trust, and creates the kind of influence that comes from character rather than force. As you begin applying these principles in your own life, remember that mastery comes through practice, not perfection. You will make mistakes. You will sometimes lose your temper, say things you regret, and handle conflicts poorly. I certainly did, even after years of teaching these principles to others. The goal isn't to become a perfect communicator overnight, it's to gradually develop the habits and reflexes that serve your relationships and your objectives. Start with one principle that resonates most strongly with you. Perhaps it's the commitment to never try to win arguments, or the practice of asking questions instead of making statements. Focus on that single principle until it becomes natural, then gradually incorporate others into your approach. Pay attention to the results you're getting. Notice how people respond differently to you as you change your approach to conflict. Observe how your own stress levels decrease when you stop fighting battles that don't need to be fought. Watch how your relationships deepen when you prioritize understanding over being understood. Most importantly, remember that your calm leadership in conflict doesn't just benefit you, it serves everyone around you. In a world filled with anger, defensiveness, and destructive argument, your commitment to peaceful resolution becomes a gift to your family, your colleagues, your community, and future generations who will learn from your example. The choice you make in each moment of potential conflict, to escalate or de-escalate, to attack or understand, to win the argument or preserve the relationship, these choices shape not only your immediate outcomes, but your character and legacy. Choose to be the person who brings peace rather than conflict, understanding rather than judgment, solutions rather than problems. Your calm leadership matters more than you know, and its influence will extend far beyond anything you can imagine.